Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we step into the echoing streets of ancient Rome, where marble columns gleam in moonlight and the chatter of taverns fades into the hum of distant fountains. You follow the smell of olive oil lamps and the faint perfume of laurel leaves, ready to learn about a world where millions of people were enslaved, yet surrounded by rules, customs, and restraints that shaped even the mightiest master's reach. It may feel strange. After all, in popular imagination, Roman masters could do anything, and their slaves were nothing but tools. But tonight, you're going to hear the quieter truth. Even within that harsh system, laws and traditions pressed against unchecked cruelty. And before you sink too deep into your pillow, here's your cheeky reminder. You probably wouldn't last a week as a Roman slave. The moment your Wi-Fi went down, you'd be begging for manumission. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where and when in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander down the Via Sacra, the central street of Rome, and you realise something. Even in this empire of conquest, power was never absolute. The law, cold, bureaucratic, and occasionally surprisingly humane, stood as both a weapon and a shield. For masters, it was easy to imagine themselves as emperors of the household, rulers whose nod meant life or death. Yet carved into wax tablets and written in the digesta, the sprawling collection of legal opinions were restrictions that whispered, "Not everything is yours to command." The Roman legal system treated slaves as property, yes, but property with voices, memories, and even the ability to bring complaints. Imagine a master thinking he owned every heartbeat of another person, only to learn that statutes and precedents told him what he could not do. If you think that sounds paradoxical, well, so did the Romans themselves. Historians still quarrel over how much these laws actually protected the enslaved, and how much they were really about maintaining order for the state. Was it compassion or convenience? That's the kind of late-night question that keeps scholars scribbling furiously in their study halls. The earliest Roman codes, like the 12 tables from the mid-5th century BCE, offered almost nothing in terms of safeguards. Those slabs of bronze were brutal. Slaves could be beaten, chained, or sold without hesitation. But as centuries passed and Rome shifted from a republic of stern farmers to a cosmopolitan empire of marble, attitudes changed. A master couldn't simply act like a rampaging god without consequence. Laws evolved, especially under the emperors, to remind owners that they operated under the gaze of the state. One emperor in particular, Hadrian, the bearded philosopher king of the 2nd century CE, issued an edict forbidding masters from killing their slaves without a trial. Think about that. In a society where crucifixions lined the highways, the government decided, wait, even this has limits. Picture yourself as a master in some elegant villa on the Palatine Hill. You recline on a couch, goblet of wine in hand, while a slave fumbles to pour it without spilling. Perhaps you're tempted to lash out. But then, somewhere in your mind, you recall that if you strike too harshly or kill in a fit of rage, you could face trial before Roman magistrates. Even worse, you could be accused of wasting the emperor's human resources. Rome relied on slaves for everything. From tutoring children in Greek philosophy to maintaining the aqueducts that carried water to every fountain. To destroy them recklessly was not only cruel, but economically foolish. And here's a quirky tidbit. Roman satirists often mocked masters who went overboard with punishment. One comic poet joked that a master killed his slaves simply because the man sneezed at dinner, and the audience roared. Not because it was funny to imagine, but because it was absurd, a violation of the understood boundaries. That boundary, where humour shaded into horror, was precisely where the law sometimes stepped in. Yet don't imagine these restrictions as modern-style rights. No Roman legislator sat down and thought, let's protect human dignity. Instead, their concern was the stability of the household and the preservation of a functioning labour force. The state wanted slaves healthy enough to work, alive enough to serve, and quiet enough not to spark rebellions. So masters were constantly reminded, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, that their will was not divine. You walk deeper into this thought, past the marble baths where senators whisper, and you hear echoes of debates. Jurists like Ulpian and Gaius, whose writings later filled volumes of legal commentary, spelled out curious contradictions. Slaves are property, yet also people who can commit crimes. Masters are rulers, yet bound by custom and law. If you're feeling a headache coming on, you're not alone. Even the Romans admitted their definitions wobbled like badly set jelly. There's a story about Emperor Antoninus Pius in the 2nd century CE. He decreed that if a master treated his slaves with extraordinary cruelty, the slaves could appeal to the authorities and be sold to someone else. Imagine the scene. A line of weary men and women whispering to a magistrate about their owner's abuses, and the state stepping in to remove them from the household. It wasn't freedom, not even close, but it was a subtle leash tied around the master's hand. You couldn't endlessly torment without risking your investment. Meanwhile, philosophers joined the conversation. The Stoics, with their calm pronouncements that all humans shared in divine reason, created ripples in Roman conscience. They argued that to mistreat slaves was to insult yourself, since the soul of a slave was just as capable of virtue as yours. That thought alone probably kept some masters from swinging the whip too freely. Still, whether these high-minded arguments changed daily life or simply polished elite reputations is a matter scholars debate late into the night. And then there's the curious matter of familia. Roman households were vast networks, not just blood relatives but slaves, freedmen, clients, and dependents. The paterfamilias, or head of household, had near-mythic authority, but even his power was hedged by tradition. You couldn't simply unravel the threads of the household without consequences rippling outward. Kill too many slaves, and neighbours whispered. Abuse them visibly, and patrons looked askance. In a society obsessed with reputation, appearances often restrained cruelty more effectively than statutes. Of course, limits could be uneven. A wealthy senator might hesitate to break a law because rivals would seize on his scandal, while a humble farmer in the countryside might risk harsher treatment of his slaves without fear of gossip. The city's eyes, however, always mattered. Rome itself was a stage, and every act, even behind closed villa doors, risked leaking into the rumour mills of the forum. If you've ever felt the fear of being caught on an embarrassing live stream, you get a small taste of what Roman masters endured in the gaze of their peers. Still, the existence of these limits mattered. They remind you that even in an age where slavery was unquestioned, the master's hand was not free to do absolutely everything. And that fact alone, restrictions inside brutality, is one of history's most haunting paradoxes. It's like discovering that a cage has bars not only for the birds trapped within, but also for the person who holds the key. As you drift through the moonlit forums of this story, picture the slaves themselves, watchful, calculating, aware that law and custom sometimes gave them leverage. Some would slip notes to a patron, others whisper complaints to officials. There are even accounts of slaves standing in court as witnesses against their master's excesses. If that surprises you, good. Ancient Rome was messy, full of contradictions. The masters could command, but they could not ignore the invisible net of law, tradition, and gossip that bound them in turn. So when you hear people say Roman slaves were utterly powerless, remember this stroll through the marble avenues. Power in Rome was always a negotiation, even in the darkest corners of the household. You follow the lamps down another street, the stones slick with late-night dew, and you overhear a whispered story from centuries past. A master who once killed a slave over something as trivial as a misplaced goblet. In earlier days, such an act would have been brushed aside as nothing more than property damage, like snapping the leg of a chair. But by the height of the Roman Empire, such casual killings had grown too costly for the state to ignore. The empire was built on backs that carried water jars, tilled fields, and sharpened quills. Losing those workers for the sake of a tantrum seemed less like discipline and more like sabotage. And that is why, gradually but firmly, the government made it clear, murdering your own slave out of sheer whim was not something you could do without consequence. Think about it. Rome's population may have included nearly 1 in 3 people enslaved during certain eras. That's millions of men, women, and children whose labour made marble temples rise, aqueducts stretch over valleys, and banquets overflow with food. If every frustrated master acted on a sudden violent impulse, the empire's labour force would dwindle at alarming speed. The Senate and emperors realised that stability required restraint, even if the language of that restraint was clothed in legalese rather than compassion. It was less about kindness, and more about cold practicality. keep the slaves alive, or watch the economy wobble. By the time of Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, the law spelled out explicitly that a master could not simply slaughter a slave without going through judicial procedures. The emperor decreed that killing a slave in a fit of rage was tantamount to homicide. That might sound obvious to us, of course killing someone counts as homicide, but in Rome, where human beings were legally classified as property, it was a shocking shift. Suddenly slaves weren't just objects, they were lives that the state had an interest in preserving. You can almost picture the scene, a furious landowner in the countryside raising his staff to strike, only to remember that the local magistrate could now summon him to court. There, neighbours and freedmen might testify, and suddenly the man's reputation would hang by a thread. The law had turned his private outburst into a public liability. It's like thinking you can delete a text without consequence, only to discover it's already been screenshot and passed around. Historians still debate how often these laws were enforced. Did Roman magistrates truly punish elite masters, or did they look the other way? Evidence suggests that enforcement varied wildly. A senator might bribe his way to leniency, while a less connected farmer could face real penalties. What mattered more was the precedent. Masters now lived under the shadow of accountability. Even the threat of trial curbed some of the worst impulses, and here's a curious anecdote. One source mentions that Emperor Caligula, yes, the same infamous figure remembered for extravagance and alleged madness, once intervened to stop a master from killing a slave simply because he was bored of him. Whether Caligula did this out of genuine concern or as a way to humiliate the master is uncertain, but the story underscores how shocking casual killings could appear even to Romans who otherwise tolerated brutality. If something was scandalous enough for gossip, it was dangerous for reputation. Imagine then the awkward balancing act. Masters were expected to maintain discipline, to project authority in front of their household, yet they were also expected to avoid becoming villains in the eyes of the law and society. A slap or a flogging might pass unnoticed, but a corpse, that was paperwork, scandal, and possibly exile. So many masters learned the art of controlling their temper, if only to preserve their standing. You can almost hear the sighs of ancient household slaves, who noticed that the law's shadow made their daily survival just a fraction safer. The legal texts preserved in Justinian's Digest centuries later spell it out with striking clarity. Killing a slave without due cause was forbidden, and the act could be prosecuted like any murder. Think of the irony. Slaves could not vote, could not marry legally, could not hold public office, yet their lives were shielded by laws that treated them as more than disposable things. That contradiction became part of Rome's strange legacy, where humanity peeked through the cracks of oppression. Of course, some punishments still led to death, execution after trial, forced labour in mines or combat in the arena. The difference was that these deaths had to be sanctioned by legal process, not dictated by a master's fleeting mood. The empire wanted order, not chaos, and in that order, the casual killing was erased as an option. You might wonder how slaves themselves viewed these protections. While we can only guess, graffiti scratched into walls suggests they were aware of their rights, or at least their limited shields. A scribble in Pompeii mocks a master for his temper, hinting that even ordinary Romans gossiped about those who broke these norms. Word spread quickly in a city where every tavern doubled as a rumour hub. Now picture the psychological shift. A master, once unchallenged, now forced to think twice. The old saying, "A man is king in his own house," still echoed through Roman halls, but with a new footnote, so long as he doesn't kill his subjects without reason. That footnote may have been invisible on the lintel, but it was etched deep in law and memory. There's also the question of imperial politics. Emperors, ever paranoid about revolts, wanted to prevent discontent from spreading. Enslaved people were not powerless. They could and did revolt, most famously under Spartacus in the 1st century BCE. That rebellion shook Rome to its core and left tens of thousands dead. After such trauma, any sign that the enslaved masses might become restless was treated seriously. Preventing casual killings was one way to reduce unnecessary sparks. Why risk igniting rage when discipline could be kept within controlled channels? Here's where it gets almost comedic. Some Roman moralists scolded masters not for cruelty but for foolishness. Wasting a slave's life was likened to smashing a perfectly good amphora of wine because you didn't like the label. Practical Romans loved efficiency, and efficiency meant keeping your workforce intact. A historian once quipped that Roman slavery was inhuman but not irrational, and nowhere is that clearer than in these laws against random murder. As you tread further into this nighttime reflection, imagine standing before a marble relief showing a master surrounded by slaves. On the surface, the scene radiates control and hierarchy. But behind that stone silence lurks the knowledge that the master's power is checked by invisible boundaries. The law is the unseen figure in the relief, reminding him that violence carried too far could rebound with sharp consequences. Even the language Romans used betrays this shift. The word dominus meant lord, but it was increasingly paired with expectations of moderation. A good dominus was firm but not reckless, commanding but not bloodthirsty. Philosophers like Seneca advised masters to treat slaves as companions in fortune, warning that cruelty degraded the master more than the servant. You sense the contradiction pulsing. Here is a society that normalized slavery, yet simultaneously cultivated unease about unbridled violence. And still, questions linger. Were these restrictions truly about protecting slaves, or simply about keeping masters from embarrassing themselves and endangering order? Scholars continue to argue, pointing to cases where the law was ignored and brutality carried on. Perhaps the truth lies in the tension. Rome wanted both discipline and restraint, cruelty and control. The city sleeps now around you in this story, torches guttering out, but the image remains vivid. No matter how wealthy or arrogant, a master could not casually kill a slave without risk. The law hovered, the emperor watched, and the whisper of rebellion haunted every shadow. In the end, the prohibition on casual killing was less about mercy and more about survival. The survival of slaves, yes, but also the survival of Rome itself. You leave behind the narrow alley where whispers of forbidden killing still linger, and now your footsteps echo through a colonnaded basilica, a Roman courthouse where marble walls amplify every cough and rustle. The air smells faintly of incense and beeswax from the tablets that scribes use, and you realise here, in this echoing hall of law, even slaves could become part of the drama. It may shock you to imagine a person legally defined as property stepping into the orbit of Roman justice, but this happened, at least sometimes. And when it did, it meant masters were no longer insulated by the illusion of total control. Courts were the stage where slaves could indirectly cry out, and where magistrates, jurists, and imperial representatives could intervene, nudging household authority back into line with the needs of the state. Picture yourself seated at the back, drowsy from a day of amphora hauling, watching a trial unfold. A slave, skin pale with fear, has petitioned through a patron, claiming unbearable cruelty at the hands of her master. How does such a case even arrive here? Roman procedure was complex. Slaves could not technically bring cases themselves. The law said they lacked legal standing. But here's where cracks in the wall appeared. Sympathetic patrons, freedmen, or officials could carry a complaint forward. And if the abuse was too public or too shocking, sometimes even the community whispered until officials acted. The Emperor Antoninus Pius, whose reign stretched in the 2nd century CE, formalised this surprising avenue. His decrees stated that slaves abused with extreme cruelty could be removed from a master and sold to another. Imagine that, the empire acknowledging that, while slaves were property, there existed a threshold of cruelty so excessive that the state itself would intervene. The master might have believed himself unquestioned ruler, yet suddenly courtrooms and magistrates told him otherwise. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine attempt to protect the enslaved, or simply a clever method to avoid uprisings. After all, a slave beaten to death or tortured endlessly could not contribute to taxes, work the fields, or serve tea at banquets. The state's interest in order often masqueraded as compassion. Still, for the slave facing unbearable abuse, the distinction might not have mattered. Survival was survival. Here's a quirky vignette that ancient writers loved to repeat. A master once ordered his slaves to be thrown to the lampreys in his fish pond after they dropped a dish. The story horrified audiences, and later writers claim the emperor himself intervened to censure such grotesque cruelty. Whether every detail is true is uncertain, but the tale travelled far because it illustrated what courts could do. Step in when cruelty went too far, embarrass the master, and remind society that even property laws had moral edges. The image of a wriggling pool of lampreys became a symbol of excess punished by the watchful eyes of justice. You sit back, listening to the lawyers argue. Roman advocates spoke with theatrical flair, mixing philosophy with practical law. They might invoke the dignity of the empire, the sanctity of order, even the god's displeasure at a household that descended into madness. Beneath their words, though, the central truth was clear. A master could be dragged into court if his violence threatened more than just his own reputation. The courts became the empire's way of whispering, "We see you, and we will act if necessary." The paradox deepens here. While slaves could be protected against outrageous cruelty, they were also punished harshly through legal channels. For instance, if a slave killed a master, Roman law demanded collective punishment. Every slave in the household might be executed. That chilling decree revealed the other face of the courts, protective in rare moments, brutal in others, always leaning toward maintaining the balance of power. You see the contradiction, don't you? The same system that saved one slave from lampreys could annihilate dozens for one act of defiance. It's like a scale weighted unevenly, but never entirely tipped to one side. In this courtroom you also witness how appearances mattered. Masters accused of cruelty often scrambled to prove their benevolence. They paraded examples of good treatment, slaves with minor privileges, household members fed and clothed decently, or former servants who had been freed. These testimonies served as a shield, a way to show the magistrates that, whatever the complaint, the household was not a den of sadism. And sometimes the courts believed them. The dance between accusation and defence was delicate, a negotiation of reputation rather than absolute justice. And yet, the very existence of these trials mattered. For slaves, it meant there was a thin crack in the wall of oppression. A master who pushed too far could be embarrassed, stripped of property or forced to sell. For other masters, it meant tempering their violence lest they invite the humiliation of being dragged before a judge. And for Rome, it meant a form of control, a reminder that the emperor and his courts remained the ultimate masters above all households. One scholar once described Roman law as a patchwork cloak stitched with contradictions. You feel the fabric of that cloak here. In one thread, the denial of personhood. In another, the grudging admission that even a slave's life had limits worth guarding. In one stitch, the execution of entire households. In another, the saving of one person from monstrous cruelty. No wonder historians quarrel endlessly about the real impact. Was it progressive, oppressive, or simply pragmatic? Perhaps all three at once. Here's another curious tidbit. Evidence survives that some slaves themselves became skilled at navigating these court systems, whispering petitions to patrons, forging alliances with freedmen, even slipping information to sympathetic officials. Inscriptions on tombstones sometimes thank patrons who rescued enslaved people from cruel masters. These stones, silent and worn, testify that courts were not just abstract institutions but lifelines, remembered with gratitude. As you imagine this basilica buzzing with voices, remember too that Roman courts were as much theatre as they were justice. The marble columns, the stern magistrates, the hum of scribes, all were props in a performance designed to reinforce Rome's grandeur. A master punished for cruelty became not just an individual story, but a public lesson, an assurance that Rome kept order in every household, from the palaces of senators to the kitchens of bakers. You feel the chill of stone under your sandals as the proceedings end. The magistrate delivers a verdict. The slave will be sold to another master, and the cruel owner fined. It isn't freedom. It isn't equality. But it is survival, a small reshaping of fate by the machinery of law. As the crowd disperses, you catch whispers of skepticism. Some mutter that the system was rarely fair, that powerful masters often escape true consequences. Others insist that at least the worst horrors were checked. The debate follows you out into the streets, where oil lamps flicker against the walls and the city exhales its nocturnal breath. The lesson clings to you like the scent of incense. In Rome, courts were both shield and sword. They reminded masters that their authority, however vast, was not beyond scrutiny. They gave slaves a fragile lifeline, a way, however indirect, to push back against unrelenting cruelty. And they gave the empire a tool to keep order in a society forever balanced on the edge of rebellion. The basilica doors close behind you, and you step back into the night, the moon climbing higher. You can still hear echoes of voices arguing, judges pronouncing, and scribes scratching notes. Those echoes follow you, reminding you that the law was never silent, even in the darkest corners of Roman slavery. You drift away from the basilica's solemn stone arches, where magistrates scolded masters for cruelty, and the night air pulls you toward the glow of temple torches. The scent of burning incense mingles with crushed laurel leaves under your sandals, and the hush of worshippers reminds you that Roman life was not only ruled by law, but also by custom, ritual, and the sacred. In these dimly lit precincts, you discover another subtle but undeniable restraint. Masters could not always demand what crossed religious or spiritual boundaries. A society so entangled with the gods, omens, and ritual taboos inevitably imposed limits even on the most arrogant household ruler. The Romans saw their world as a constant negotiation with unseen forces. Every action, from ploughing a field to signing a treaty, risked angering divine powers if done incorrectly. Masters, therefore, could not simply drag slaves into every act of service without considering ritual purity. Slaves could carry offerings, clean temples, even act as assistants in ceremonies, but there were lines they could not be forced to cross. For example, certain rites required free citizens only. Pushing a slave into those roles risked invalidating the ritual itself. Imagine the embarrassment of a proud master insisting on his slave's participation, only to have a priest shake his head and declare the sacrifice null. In a city where the favour of the gods was life and death, that was no small warning. You might be tempted to chuckle at this irony. The gods did what law often hesitated to do. They made certain boundaries inviolable, reminding masters that divine rules trumped household whims. If the law whispered, the gods thundered. And Romans took those thunders seriously. A single bad omen could stop a military campaign, so why risk a household curse by ignoring sacred propriety? Historians still argue whether these religious restrictions were designed to protect slaves, or simply to protect rituals from contamination. Likely the latter. But in effect, it meant a slave might avoid certain humiliations or dangers, not because the master relented, but because the master feared divine punishment. Picture a master pausing mid-command, reconsidering whether forcing a slave into a ritual would offend Jupiter. Suddenly, even the humblest slave carried a kind of invisible shield, the shield of taboo. One quirky story floats through the ancient sources. In some households, slaves were not allowed to prepare the sacred cakes offered during festival days because their touch was considered ritually unclean. Instead, the household's daughters or freeborn dependents performed the task. The result? Slaves could chuckle privately while watching their betters fuss with flour and honey under the watchful eyes of the gods. For once, being excluded was a small mercy, and it wasn't only about rituals. Temples themselves offered spaces where slaves could not easily be dragged by force. Sanctuary laws existed across the ancient world, and Rome absorbed some of those traditions. A slave who fled into a temple might claim asylum, at least temporarily. Of course, masters often waited outside, impatient and fuming, but the idea that sacred ground imposed hesitation was powerful. To storm a temple and seize someone from the altar was to risk angering the gods, and no Roman wanted that hanging over his household. The practice of asylum was inconsistent, sometimes honoured, sometimes ignored. Yet its existence proved something vital. Not even the household ruler could erase the lines drawn by religion. The gods had their own jurisdiction, and their invisible courts could eclipse even the might of emperors. In that sense, sacred boundaries became another check against total domination. Picture yourself wandering into a temple at night, oil lamps flickering, mosaics glimmering with half-seen colours. In the shadows, a slave kneels, whispering prayers not only for mercy, but also for protection against a cruel master. You realise how powerful belief can be. The master may thunder, but the gods may refuse to listen to him. And if a magistrate saw this act, he might hesitate to force the slave back, fearing the stain of sacrilege. Law, custom, and faith intertwined in ways no master could completely control. Philosophers, too, reflected on these religious lines. Cicero, that endlessly verbose statesman, once mused that justice came not from human law, but from divine order. If you think that sounds lofty, imagine it delivered in his droning legal orations. Still, the idea that divinity imposed duties even on masters gained traction. To violate those duties was not only dishonourable, but dangerous. Slaves then existed not only in the shadow of Roman law, but also under the eye of Jupiter, Minerva, and countless household spirits. It's fascinating to note how households themselves carried religious taboos. The lares and penates, household gods, required daily offerings. If a master abused slaves too flagrantly, he risked polluting his own domestic rituals. Neighbours whispered that angry slaves could curse the household gods through mere presence. Whether true or not, the fear persisted. A trembling hand lighting incense might remember the eyes of those enslaved nearby, and the master might think twice before pushing cruelty too far. You might grin at the thought that the spiritual bureaucracy of Rome was as tangled as any modern tax code. For every ritual there was a rule, for every rule an exception. But those tangles created tiny shelters, loopholes where slaves found a sliver of protection. Not freedom, not equality, but moments when a master's command had to stop short at the temple door. Archaeological evidence even suggests that some slaves leveraged religion to resist. Inscriptions dedicate offerings to gods on behalf of slaves, sometimes funded by their tiny personal savings. These dedications were public, carved in stone, a reminder to everyone, including masters, that the divine eye was watching. A master might ignore a complaint to a magistrate, but he could not ignore an altar glowing with offerings that carried his slave's name. In a society obsessed with omens, that was dangerous ground. And here's the humour in it. Romans might laugh at foreign rituals, sneering at Egyptian priests with shaved heads, or Gallic druids muttering in forests. But they would quake in their sandals at the thought of offending their own gods through ritual mistakes. A master could sneer at a slave's humanity, yet bow nervously if a priest told him the gods disapproved of his actions. In the end, religion forced even the proudest dominus to bend. Historians continue to wonder whether sanctuary and sacred restrictions truly saved many lives, or were rare exceptions. Perhaps only a handful of slaves ever escaped torment through temple doors. Yet symbolically, the possibility mattered. It proved that masters did not own every corner of existence. Sacred boundaries belonged to the gods, and the gods refused to yield them to any mortal, however wealthy or cruel. As you leave the temple precincts, the night grows quieter. You hear the murmur of prayers fading, the soft shuffle of sandals, the clink of bronze as offerings are laid on the altar. You sense that in Rome, power was always negotiated not just between men, but between men and gods. Masters could command bodies, but they could not erase the lines etched by religion. And for those living under slavery, those divine lines were sometimes the only barriers keeping despair from becoming destruction. The torchlight fades, and you step once more into the open street. Behind you, the temple's shadows stretch long and deep, like reminders that in ancient Rome, even chains could not pass through sacred thresholds without consequence. You drift further down Rome's midnight streets, past bakeries cooling their loaves and taverns shuttering their doors, until you hear laughter from a modest courtyard. Inside, a group of slaves huddle together, not plotting escape but whispering about love, about who fancies whom, about whether they'll ever be allowed to marry. You pause because here lies another restraint upon the master's hand, the tangled question of marriage. Owners couldn't simply do whatever they pleased with slaves' unions, not entirely anyway. In a society obsessed with order, lineage and piety, the bonds of affection and family carried weight, even if the law itself refused to call those bonds marriage, in the same way it recognized the unions of free citizens. Roman law coined a term for slave partnerships, contubernium. The word literally meant sharing a hut, a nod to the cramped living quarters many slaves endured. It wasn't legally binding in the way a Roman citizen marriage, connubium, was, but it was acknowledged. Masters arranged these pairings, encouraged them, or at least tolerated them, because stable unions among slaves often meant more children born into slavery, what the Romans cheerfully called homegrown labour. But once those unions formed, something strange happened. Tradition and social expectation began to recognise them as real, even if the law tried to keep them at arm's length. Imagine a master, irritated by a quarrel, thinking to split up a couple simply to prove authority. In theory, yes, he could sell one partner to another household. But in practice, boundaries emerged. Neighbours frowned upon households notorious for shattering families. Philosophers scolded against it, muttering that a master who broke bonds of affection would invite disorder. And emperors, keenly aware of the social unrest that cruelty could breed, issued edicts discouraging such casual disruption. Emperor Claudius, in the 1st century CE, known for his stammer and love of scholarship, issued a remarkable decision. If a master sold a slave away from his or her partner without good reason, the sale could be contested. Suddenly, love, mocked in comedy and dramatised in poetry, had legal echoes. It meant that, although slaves had no formal right to marry, their unions were not entirely invisible. A master had to think twice before casually dissolving them, lest he end up entangled in the courts or shamed in public opinion. Historians still dispute how widely these protections applied. Some argue they were rare exceptions, invoked only in high-profile cases. Others believe the cultural weight of family bonds exerted steady pressure across Roman society. Either way, the dilemma was real. Masters could not act as though feelings and attachments simply didn't exist. They had to navigate the messy terrain of love under chains. Here's a quirky glimpse preserved in an inscription. One freed woman set up a tomb for her husband, who had once been enslaved alongside her. The epitaph describes their decades together as though theirs had been a legal marriage, complete with vows and fidelity. Scholars chuckle at how boldly this couple ignored legal technicalities. In their hearts, they were married, and they dared carve it in stone. Tombstones like these embarrassed masters who insisted that slaves' unions were meaningless. After all, if the dead could testify to their partnerships, who could deny their endurance? For masters, the marriage dilemma also carried practical challenges. Slaves in stable relationships often grew protective of each other. Threaten one, and you risked resistance from the other. This bond could complicate discipline, for love breeds courage. A master might hesitate before flogging one partner in front of the other, knowing the act could ignite rebellion within the household. Even the most calculating dominus had to factor in the unpredictable strength of affection. Philosophers, ever eager to moralise, weighed in. Seneca, the Stoic tutor of Nero, mused that slaves were human beings with passions, loyalties, and hearts. He warned masters against tearing those bonds apart, for it degraded not only the enslaved but the master's own dignity. Was he sincere or simply polishing his reputation as a wise man? Hard to say. But his words contributed to an atmosphere where household heads faced subtle restraints. Consider also the role of religion. Roman society revered household gods, and the idea of tearing apart a family, even an enslaved one, risked polluting those sacred relationships. Neighbours might whisper that the gods of the hearth turned cold when a master sold a child from its mother or a husband from his wife. In a culture where omens mattered, that kind of gossip had weight. Still, the dilemma wasn't solved neatly. Masters remained powerful, and many did sell off partners or children when it suited them. But every time they did, they risked running afoul of opinion, law, or divine disfavour. They had to live with the knowledge that some acts, though possible, carried invisible costs. Power, it turned out, was never as total as it seemed. One odd detail from the jurist Ulpian's writing survives. He admitted that while slave unions weren't legal marriages, they should still be respected as natural marriages. That word, natural, was a quiet bombshell. It implied that love and family belonged to the human condition itself, transcending legal categories. Even while denying full recognition, Roman law couldn't help but acknowledge the reality of these relationships. For a system obsessed with classification, that was an uncomfortable concession. Let's pause on a little humour. Imagine a master trying to lecture his household. You are not legally married. Meanwhile, the slave couple just rolls their eyes and says, "Tell that to our 3 children and 10 years together." The absurdity was obvious even to Romans, which is why playwrights poked fun at it. In comedy, the stubbornness of love often outwitted the pompous declarations of masters. As you wander past shrines to Venus, goddess of love, you sense how deep this dilemma ran. Love refused to vanish under whips and chains. It crept into slave quarters, flowered in secret glances, and sometimes reached even into courts and temples. Masters could not banish it. They could only manage it, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with reluctant respect. Archaeology gives us glimpses too. Skeletons found in shared graves hint at slave couples buried together, whether by order of kind masters or by the efforts of communities that honoured their bond. Even in death these unions persisted, defying the law's cold silence. And when you stand before such graves, the weight of the dilemma is clear. No master could truly erase the human drive for partnership. So in Rome, the marriage dilemma became another leash on authority. Slaves' unions, though officially dismissed, carried enough cultural, religious and emotional weight to constrain even the most arrogant dominus. It didn't make slavery humane, but it did prove that power met resistance not only in revolt, but in affection. And that affection, messy, stubborn, unyielding, reminded everyone that the enslaved were not objects, but people whose lives wove into the fabric of society. As the courtyard laughter fades and the city's night deepens, you carry this truth with you. Even in the empire of iron chains, love carved out space, and masters had to reckon with it. The city sleeps deeper now, oil lamps sputtering low, and you pass beneath an arch carved with triumphs of emperors long dead. The stones seem to whisper of cruelty, chains rattling, whips cracking, bodies broken. But then another voice cuts in, quieter, unexpected. Even here, in the heart of a brutal system, there were limits. Certain punishments, though common in other times or imagined in fiction, were banned outright or severely restricted by Roman law and custom. The master's hand, so often imagined as omnipotent, was clipped at the wrist when it reached too far into cruelty that society judged intolerable. You picture a dominus, angry at a slave who has spilled wine or whispered gossip. In the heat of rage, he might dream up some grotesque punishment, flaying, mutilating, feeding to wild animals. Yet across the centuries, emperors and jurists quietly scribbled lines in wax and ink saying, "No, you cannot do that." The body of a slave might be property in legal terms, but some acts were deemed so destabilizing, so obscene, that even Rome drew a red line. One of the most striking restrictions concerned crucifixion. While the empire used crucifixion liberally against rebels, criminals, and conquered peoples, there came to be debates about whether masters could casually crucify their own slaves. Under Augustus and later emperors, crucifixion became less an internal household punishment, and more a state-controlled execution. A master who nailed a slave to a cross without legal sanction risked being accused of murder. Crucifixion was rebranded as a punishment for crimes against the state, not for household squabbles. Imagine the disappointment of a cruel dominus realizing he couldn't just set up a cross in the garden to make a point. The empire reserved that grisly spectacle for itself. Another forbidden act was deliberate mutilation. Roman jurists considered it excessive to blind, castrate, or maim a slave without cause. There were exceptions. Castration was practiced in some periods, particularly for those destined to serve in temples or as eunuchs in elite households, but over time, restrictions grew sharper. By the time of Emperor Domitian, the castration of slaves was explicitly forbidden in many cases. The reasoning wasn't humanitarian so much as practical. Mutilated slaves were less valuable, less productive, and their suffering risked scandal. Masters who ignored this rule could face penalties, and merchants caught selling eunuchs illegally were punished too. Historians still debate how consistently this ban was enforced. Some sources suggest black market castration persisted, especially where demand for eunuchs was high. Others argue the state cracked down hard, using the ban as both moral posturing and economic regulation. The debate continues because evidence is patchy, but the very existence of the law proves the point. Not every punishment was permissible. Here's a quirky tidbit you'll enjoy. One Roman poet, Juvenal, sneered at masters who staged over-the-top punishments. He mocked a lady of a high society who supposedly ordered a slave's tongue cut out just for talking back. Audiences laughed uneasily because they knew such punishments, though whispered about, were condemned in practice. Comedy became a mirror, exaggerating cruelty to shame those who even thought about it. Imagine today's late-night comedians mocking politicians. Rome had its own version, scolding excess through satire, but perhaps the most significant forbidden punishment was exposure to beasts outside of the judicial system. The amphitheatre was a theatre of horror, yes, but it was controlled by the state. A master could not simply toss a slave into the arena lions for personal amusement. That was the prerogative of magistrates, and the empire guarded its spectacles jealously. If every master staged his own miniature circus of gore, the authority of the Colosseum would be diluted. So, the lions were off limits for domestic punishments, another quiet boundary that clipped private cruelty. You may find yourself wondering why. Why would such a merciless empire bother drawing these lines? The answer lies in balance. Rome thrived on control, not chaos. Random cruelty threatened order, invited rebellion, and wasted valuable human resources. Even philosophers chimed in. Seneca warned that cruelty degraded the soul of the master, while Musonius Rufus argued that moderation was the mark of a civilized man. Whether these musings softened hearts or just polished reputations is debatable, but they contributed to a culture where certain punishments looked barbaric, even by Roman standards. And here's where things get even stranger. Some punishments were not only banned, but criminalised. Killing a slave with deliberate torture could bring charges of homicide, as we've seen before. But mutilation and extreme sadism also brought risks of public censure. Masters lived under the constant gaze of neighbours, clients, and the state. To be labelled a monster was politically dangerous. You might think of it as Rome's version of bad press. One scandalous punishment could ruin your standing in the Senate faster than losing a debate. Archaeology gives us glimpses of the tension. Graffiti from Pompeii depicts whips and chains, reminders of common punishments, but never mutilations or executions staged by private owners. The absence speaks loudly. Certain acts were beyond what even graffiti artists would normalise. Instead, depictions focus on humiliation. Slaves serving, slaves beaten, but not slaves torn apart. Society, it seems, knew where its comfort zone ended. Still, loopholes existed. Masters could starve a slave, confine them in chains, or send them to brutal labour in mines. These punishments, while technically legal, sometimes crossed into de facto death sentences. The difference was subtle. Death by neglect or overwork could be excused as unfortunate, but death by mutilation or theatrical cruelty screamed intentional excess. Rome preferred its cruelty clean, wrapped in rhetoric of order rather than chaos. The forbidden punishments also reveal Rome's obsession with appearances. Crucifixions, mutilations, and feeding slaves to beasts looked messy, barbaric, foreign. Rome prided itself on being civilized, superior to the barbarians at its borders. By outlawing certain acts, Romans reassured themselves that their cruelty was at least organized. It's a bit like someone boasting they only yell at waiters but never throw food. Still harsh, but carefully curated harshness. And because Rome was never without irony, some masters tried to skirt the bans. A master might send an unwanted slave to a mine, knowing the conditions were fatal, rather than risk legal trouble for direct execution. Or he might accidentally overwork someone to death. The state tolerated these shadows because proving intent was difficult. But the bans still mattered. They forced cruelty into the shadows, turned it into whispers instead of public acts. And that difference gave slaves a tiny wedge of safety, however fragile. Let's pause for a wry smile. Imagine a Roman dinner party where one guest boasts, "I whipped my slave 100 times yesterday." Another chimes in, "Well, I had him chained to the wall," but if someone piped up, "I chopped off his hand," the room would fall silent. Even among elites who lived off enslaved labour, there were acts that went too far, that chilled the air. That silence, that judgment, was itself a form of boundary. Historians continue to argue whether these bans were honoured in practice or just lip service. Some believe they were rarely enforced, pointing to evidence of underground cruelty. Others insist the laws had teeth, citing cases where masters were punished. The truth, as always, probably lies in the middle. What's clear is that Rome wanted cruelty to remain structured, not anarchic. Forbidden punishments were a way to protect the state's monopoly on spectacular violence and to curb the worst excesses of private rage. So, as you walk away from the arch, the city's silence heavy around you, remember, even in Rome, where chains clinked in every alley, there were punishments that could not be ordered with a snap of the fingers. Crucifixion, mutilation, theatrical feeding to beasts. These belonged to the state, to courts, to spectacle. The master in his villa could command many things, but not everything. His power stopped at the edges of Rome's obsession with order, reputation, and divine propriety. And that boundary, invisible but firm, was yet another reminder that no matter how absolute slavery seemed, it was never total. Somewhere between law and taboo, the master's whip met limits, and the slave's body, however vulnerable, was not infinitely available for cruelty. The dawn is still hours away, and you wander past the looming walls of an insula, one of Rome's crowded apartment blocks. From a window above, you hear the faint groan of a tired slave rising to light the kitchen fires. It sparks a thought. Masters could demand endless labour, couldn't they? After all, wasn't a slave considered property, like a tool to be used until it broke? And yet, step a little closer, and you discover another subtle check against absolute power. The Romans, so practical and efficiency obsessed, drew lines, sometimes legal, sometimes moral, around how much work a slave could be forced to do. These were the workload ceilings, invisible limits where overexertion became not only cruel but counterproductive. Think of the empire as a machine powered by human energy. Millions of enslaved bodies ploughed fields, carried bricks, copied scrolls, poured wine. Without them, aqueducts would not flow, baths would not steam, senators' speeches would not echo. But Rome understood what modern factories also learned centuries later. Break your workers, and the machine stalls. A master who drove his slaves to exhaustion wasn't just a tyrant. He was foolish, undermining his own household's productivity. Roman agricultural writers, those earnest men scribbling advice for landowners, sometimes sound like HR manuals. Cato the Elder in the 2nd century BCE advised against overworking slaves during harvest, warning that exhausted labourers produced worse results. Varro, another agricultural guru, recommended rotations of tasks, ploughing, pruning, guarding, to avoid burning out the workforce. These authors weren't humanitarians, they were pragmatists. But their words created cultural pressure. A good master wasn't one who squeezed every drop of sweat, but one who knew when to pace his slaves for the long haul. Historians still argue whether these treatises reflect reality or idealized propaganda. Did landowners actually follow this advice, or was it just wishful thinking? Evidence suggests both. In some estates, slaves rotated duties, received rest periods, and were even granted festival days off. In others, conditions were brutal, with men and women chained in field gangs. The debate continues, but the very fact that workload limits were discussed shows that masters could not ignore the question. Here's a quirky tidbit. On Saturnalia, the festival in December when roles were briefly reversed, slaves were given a holiday, allowed to feast, and even permitted to mock their masters. Was this compassion? Not exactly. It was ritualized relief, a safety valve. By granting rest at least once a year, masters reinforced hierarchy while preventing rebellion. Even temporary pauses in labour demonstrated that endless work was frowned upon. Saturnalia was a reminder that slaves, like oxen, needed respite if they were to keep pulling the cart. The courts, too, sometimes stepped in. Surviving legal opinions show cases where slaves claimed neglect or overwork. Imagine a master who refused to provide food or demanded 20 hours of toil without pause. If the abuse became public, neighbours could intervene, and magistrates could order the slave sold to another owner. It wasn't exactly a union grievance process, but it was a boundary. The master couldn't ignore entirely the welfare of his labourers. Society demanded at least the appearance of moderation. Philosophers added their voices, draping workload ceilings in lofty language. Musonius Rufus, a Stoic thinker, argued that slaves deserved reasonable treatment because fatigue destroyed not only the body, but the soul's capacity for virtue. A slave too tired to think was, in his view, a wasted human potential. Did all masters read Musonius and nod? Probably not. But his words circulated, planting seeds of restraint. A master who prided himself on philosophical polish couldn't be seen flogging slaves until they collapsed in the mud. Imagine a villa's kitchen at dawn. Slaves chopping vegetables, grinding grain, fetching water. The mistress taps her foot impatiently. Yet even she knows that if she demands an all-night vigil before tomorrow's banquet, the cooks will stumble, the food will burn, and the feast will sour. Moderation wasn't kindness, it was common sense. A tired slave was a liability. A rested one was a resource. Masters who ignored that lesson risked ridicule for inefficiency. And here's where it gets almost humorous. Ancient writers sometimes compared slaves to livestock. A farmer who starved his oxen or overworked his horses was condemned as a fool. The same logic, by extension, applied to human labourers. Don't kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, as the proverb goes. Rome had its own version. Don't cripple the hands that harvest your grain. It may sound crass, but it was a powerful cultural ceiling. Archaeological finds strengthen this picture. Inscriptions reveal slaves who offered thanks to masters for light burdens or fair treatment. Whether those inscriptions were genuine gratitude or propaganda carved at the master's order, they indicate that workload was a recognised category of moral judgment. To brag of moderation was to signal decency. To be accused of overwork was to risk dishonour. Still, enforcement was patchy. Some estates resembled prisons, with slaves chained to their tasks and whipped for slowing down. Others offered incentives, small plots of land to cultivate, partial earnings from side work, or occasional days off. The spectrum was wide, but the ceiling existed in cultural imagination. Even the cruelest master knew there was a line that once crossed drew scrutiny. Historians continued to debate the impact. Did these workload ceilings meaningfully improve daily life, or were they fig leaves hiding relentless exploitation? The arguments rage in scholarly books, but your midnight walk reveals the truth in the streets. Exhausted bodies collapsed in doorways, yes, but also rested bodies laughing during festivals. Rome contained both extremes, bound by invisible rules of efficiency, reputation and necessity. So picture this: a slave in a vineyard, sweat streaming under the Italian sun. The overseer raises his whip but pauses, because driving the man to collapse today will ruin tomorrow's harvest. That pause, thin as it may seem, is the workload ceiling at work, invisible, unacknowledged, yet powerful enough to shape behaviour. As you pass into another street, the smell of bread lingers, and you realise the lesson. Even in chains, slaves forced masters to reckon with the limits of the body. Endless labour was an illusion. Exhaustion always struck back. The ceiling of work was built not from mercy, but from necessity, and within that ceiling lay one more restraint on Rome's harsh dominion. The streets are emptying as the moon tilts westward, but you keep walking, and your sandals click against paving stones worn smooth by centuries of feet. Around you stand the silent shells of tabernae, little shops where by day slaves would bustle about selling bread, fish or oil. You pause before one shuttered stall and realise, though the law said slaves could not own anything, here in practice they sometimes did. Masters who imagined themselves sole owners of everything inside their walls discovered an awkward truth. The enslaved were property but not property, creatures denied legal personhood yet still allowed to manage tiny pockets of wealth, called peculium. And in those small pockets lay yet another restraint. Masters couldn't always seize or squander what they technically claimed to control. The word peculium sounds unassuming, but for a Roman slave it meant survival, dignity, and the faint shimmer of possibility. It was a fund, sometimes coins, sometimes tools, sometimes livestock, set aside for a slave's use. Legally it still belonged to the master, but custom and expectation gave the slave real control. A clever servant might squirrel away a little silver, buy trinkets, or even lend money. Masters allowed it because it motivated labour. A slave with hope of building a peculium worked harder, dreaming that one day those coins might purchase manumission. But here's the catch. Once a master granted a peculium, he was not entirely free to retract it. Social norms and legal precedents frowned upon sudden confiscation. Imagine a master storming into the slave quarters, sweeping up every coin, declaring, "It's mine after all." He might face sneers from peers, whispers that he was dishonourable, perhaps even legal challenges if promises had been made. Romans despised oath-breakers, and seizing peculium without cause risked staining a household's name. The law technically backed the master, but society's gaze restrained his hand. Historians still debate the scope of this protection. Was peculium truly secure, or was it always precarious? Surviving documents show both sides. Some slaves saved large sums, enough to buy freedom outright, suggesting masters respected their autonomy. Others lost everything when a household fell into debt, the master seizing every coin to pay creditors. The argument continues, but the very existence of debate proves the point. Peculium was more than illusion. It was a grey zone, neither property nor non-property, where masters walked carefully. Here's a quirky story. One Roman slave named Eros managed a peculium so well that he acted almost like a banker. He lent money to other slaves, collected interest and grew his fund until he bought his own freedom. Later, as a freedman, he boasted about his success on his tombstone. The irony is delicious. A man once called property became a financier, his skills sharpened by the wiggle room Rome itself created. His tale shows how peculium wasn't just tolerated. It was sometimes celebrated as proof of Roman pragmatism. Philosophers also commented on this odd institution. The Stoic Epictetus, himself once enslaved, pointed out that peculium proved slaves were never mere objects. If they could save, trade, and plan, they were rational beings. To deny that reality was to lie about human nature. Masters who mocked their slaves' tiny hoards often found themselves embarrassed when jurists agreed that promises of peculium carried real weight. The institution stood as a living contradiction, reminding everyone that slaves were property in law but people in fact. Imagine standing in a villa's atrium. A trusted household slave jingles a small purse at his belt. The master notices but says nothing, perhaps even encourages it. Why? Because that purse ties the slave's fate to the household. Confiscate it, and loyalty vanishes. Allow it, and the slave works harder, dreams bigger, and behaves with more diligence. It's management by dangling hope, but it also binds the master to restraint. He cannot yank away the purse without consequences. And sometimes, peculium even extended to land. Records show slaves managing farms, vineyards, or workshops on peculium, treating them almost like leased businesses. They bought supplies, hired labourers, sold products, all in the master's name, yet with personal incentive. If the master tried to seize profits arbitrarily, he risked ruining the enterprise. Better to let the slave continue, enjoying the fruits of diligence. Thus, property but not property turned into one of Rome's cleverest systems of control and cooperation. Of course, there were limits. A slave couldn't take a master to court for stealing peculium, at least not directly, but promises mattered. If a master had publicly declared that a certain fund was dedicated toward manumission, then retracting it could spark outrage. Other masters might hesitate to trade or trust him, fearing he'd renege on deals. In a society obsessed with reputation, that was no small deterrent. There's an odd humour in this. Masters prided themselves on absolute dominion, yet found themselves negotiating with their own slaves' finances. Imagine an arrogant senator forced to explain why he seized coins meant for his cook's manumission. His peers might laugh, not because they pitied the cook, but because they despised dishonour. Once again, restraint didn't stem from kindness, but from reputation and practicality. Archaeology offers glimpses of peculium at work. Wax tablets from Herculaneum record loans and transactions managed by slaves, complete with interest rates and repayment schedules. These weren't scraps of generosity. They were structured economic activity. Slaves weren't supposed to own, yet they moved money through Rome's veins. Masters benefited, but also bound themselves. Once the system existed, it was too valuable to destroy casually. Historians still argue about the deeper meaning. Was peculium a path to empowerment, or just a gilded cage tricking slaves into loyalty? Perhaps both. Many never saved enough for freedom, their tiny funds evaporating with a master's death or a household crisis, but others did, and their tombstones and inscriptions bear witness. Each freedman who thanked his peculium revealed how even the smallest crack in law could blossom into a life transformed. And here's a playful image. Picture two slaves gossiping in a courtyard, one boasting of a few denarii saved, the other groaning that his master raided his peculium to fund a gambling spree. Both stories ring true, both part of Rome's messy contradictions. Property, yet not property. Ownership, yet restraint. Freedom dangling on a purse string. As you leave the shuttered shop behind, you realise that peculium was more than money. It was a constant reminder that even the enslaved, officially defined as property, carved out spaces of agency. And masters, though powerful, discovered that in granting this institution they had chained themselves to promises, appearances, and expectations they could not always escape. So the streets of Rome echo with this paradox. Coins clinking in a slave's purse, owned and not owned, controlled and not controlled. And in that paradox you glimpse yet another way that slavery, harsh as it was, carried boundaries the masters themselves could never fully erase. The night has grown still, with only the occasional bark of a dog echoing through the back streets of Rome. You follow the sound until you reach the edge of a workshop, its doorway marked with scratches, marks left by a fugitive slave once dragged back here. The image pulls you into another boundary of ownership, what masters could and could not do to runaways. For in an empire where thousands of people dreamed of slipping into the shadows, rules emerged to govern what happened once they were caught. The master's rage was never allowed to burn unchecked. The state, neighbours, and even religion placed limits on how far punishment could go. Picture it. A slave vanishes during the grape harvest. The master fumes, fearing not only lost labour but also the shame of gossip. Runaways, after all, suggested poor discipline in the household. Days later, the slave is dragged back, dirt-streaked, exhausted. What happens now? In the imagination of cruelty, anything could be done. Yet Roman law and custom intervened with surprising strictness. By the 1st century CE, emperors had decreed that runaway slaves could not simply be executed on the spot. Instead, they had to be returned to labour or punished through sanctioned channels. Death was not off the table entirely, but it required process, not impulse. A master who killed a runaway without trial could find himself accused of murder, a charge with teeth in the imperial era. Historians still debate why such restrictions existed. Was it because the state feared constant killing would spark rebellion? Or was it simply about economics? Why waste human capital when you could rechain it to the plough? Likely both. Whatever the motive, the effect was clear. A master confronted with a captured runaway could not simply unleash fury. He had to channel his response into forms approved by Rome's order-loving system. Here's a curious tidbit. Slaves sometimes fled not to disappear forever, but to lodge complaints. They would run to a temple, a magistrate's house, or even to statues of emperors hoping to claim asylum. If they argued that cruelty or neglect drove them away, officials might investigate. On occasion, the slave could be sold to another master. This meant that the very act of flight could trigger scrutiny, placing the master on trial in the court of public opinion. Imagine the humiliation of a proud senator having his authority questioned because a slave dared to run. Punishments for runaways did exist, of course, but even these had ceilings. Branding on the forehead with letters like FUG, for fugitivus, was common, but mutilation beyond this was often prohibited. To blind or maim a runaway risked state disapproval. Why? Because a crippled slave was less useful and more likely to inspire sympathy or unrest. Rome wanted deterrence, not waste. The punishment had to hurt without destroying the tool. Philosophers, too, chimed in. Seneca remarked that slaves fled not from labour itself, but from cruelty. He advised masters to look inward when confronted with frequent runaways. Perhaps the problem was not disobedience but mismanagement. That advice, cloaked in stoic dignity, acted as a subtle leash. A master who ignored it risked being labelled foolish as well as cruel. Archaeological finds confirm the ubiquity of runaways. Wax tablets from Egypt list bounties offered for fugitives, describing their features in detail. Graffiti in Pompeii mocks runaway slaves, warning others not to shelter them. And yet those very records prove how common running away was. It was a constant thorn in the side of masters, a reminder that ownership was never complete. Every fleeing footstep challenged the illusion of absolute control. Imagine the dilemma. A runaway caught. The master wants to terrify the others into obedience, but he knows the law bars extreme cruelty. So he compromises. Chains, branding, extra work, maybe public humiliation. Enough to instill fear, but not enough to draw the eye of magistrates. It was a delicate balancing act, a dance between fury and legality. And here's where humour sneaks in. Roman comedies often poked fun at runaways, portraying them as clever tricksters who outwitted bumbling masters. Audiences laughed, but the laughter carried an edge of truth. Everyone knew someone who had harboured a runaway, or heard tales of slaves hiding in the countryside. The jokes underlined what masters hated to admit. Slaves had agency, cunning, and sometimes the upper hand. The state, paranoid about rebellion, also set rules about harbouring runaways. Anyone caught sheltering one could face fines or worse. But again, enforcement was patchy. Whole communities sometimes conspired to hide fugitives, especially if the master was notorious for cruelty. In such cases, the law's leash pulled not only on slaves but on masters themselves. Mistreat people too flagrantly, and you risked losing control as your own neighbours turned against you. Scholars still puzzle over the branding practice. Did it deter flight, or simply mark slaves as permanently dangerous? Was it an effective warning, or did it backfire, creating solidarity among the branded? The debate continues, and perhaps will never be resolved. But the very fact that Rome adopted such a system shows its obsession with control, a control that still required restraint. Picture the branded forehead, the chains rattling in the workshop, the whispered prayers in a temple asylum. These were the images of a system straining to balance dominance with order. Runaway rules forced masters to acknowledge that their power, though vast, was tethered. They could punish but not annihilate. They could shame but not mutilate. They could threaten but not destroy without consequence. As the night deepens, you pass another alley where shadows seem to dart like fugitives. You realise that running away was itself a form of resistance, one that bent the rules of Rome back against the masters. Every time a slave fled, the system had to respond, proving again that control was never complete. So remember this lesson. In Rome, even the act of escape carved boundaries into ownership. Runaways rewrote the script, forcing masters into compromises they never admitted publicly, but always felt privately. And in those compromises, in those rules of restraint, another chain looped quietly around the dominus himself. The night air thickens with the scent of iron from a forge nearby, and you find yourself following the clatter of hammers toward the looming shape of an amphitheatre. Its arches rise against the stars, haunted by memories of roars and screams. Here you come to another boundary in the world of Roman slavery, the question of gladiators. Popular imagination paints a picture of every master tossing disgraced slaves into the arena on a whim, feeding the public's appetite for blood. But reality was less casual. The empire treated gladiators not as disposable fodder, but as valuable investments, trained assets, and tightly regulated performers. A master could not simply decide to throw a troublesome cook into combat. The decision carried rules, costs, and consequences that bound his hand more tightly than most imagine. Gladiators, after all, were not ordinary slaves. They were products of ludi, gladiatorial schools overseen by professional trainers known as lanistae. Entering one of these schools required legal contracts, fees, and imperial oversight. A master who wanted to turn a slave into a gladiator couldn't just dump him at the school gates. He had to sell him formally, transferring ownership to the lanista. That sale created obligations, and once complete, the slave's fate no longer rested entirely with the household. The empire recognised gladiators as both property and public performers, men whose deaths were tied to the honour of the games themselves. Imagine a frustrated master trying to make an example of a disobedient slave. He snarls, "I'll send you to the arena," but in practice he faces barriers. Could he afford the contract? Would a lanista even accept an untrained, unhealthy body? And even if accepted, the master had no guarantee the man would die quickly. Gladiators were valuable, trained to fight multiple times. In fact, a gladiator who survived became more valuable to the lanista, not less. The master's vengeance was swallowed by the machinery of entertainment and profit. Historians still argue over how often household slaves were funneled into gladiator schools. Some believe it was relatively rare, given the costs and complexities. Others suggest it happened frequently enough to terrify slaves into obedience. The truth may lie between. Masters threatened it more often than they carried it out, knowing the gamble was expensive and unpredictable. Here's a quirky tidbit. Records show that slaves sometimes volunteered to become gladiators, bargaining with their masters for manumission or money. It sounds absurd at first. Why choose a life of combat? But for some, the arena offered fame, meals, and a chance to earn enough to buy freedom. Compare that to endless drudgery in fields or kitchens, and suddenly the gamble looks tempting. This irony made the system even trickier for masters. If a slave begged to be sold to the arena, denying him might seem cruel, yet granting the request stripped the household of a worker. Either way, the master faced limits. Legal texts further clipped the dominus's power. Imperial edicts forbade sending certain slaves into gladiator schools without approval. For example, household tutors or artisans with specialised skills were considered too valuable to waste in the sand. The state prioritised utility. Better to keep a skilled secretary alive than to feed him to lions for a fleeting spectacle. A master who ignored this could face penalties, even confiscation of property. Once again, the empire reminded household rulers that they were not alone in command. Philosophers too commented on the issue. Cicero once noted that forcing slaves into the arena degraded the dignity of the household. Seneca, never shy about condemning cruelty, described the games as morally corrosive. Though he admitted the temptation of spectacle, their words gave cultural weight to the notion that not every slave was fair game for gladiatorial punishment. A dominus who ignored this risked being mocked as uncivilized, even by peers who themselves cheered at the Colosseum. The practicalities of gladiator life also undermined a master's vengeance. Once in a ludus, a slave underwent intense training, medical care, and diet improvements. It's almost comical. A master hoping to see his enemy suffer might inadvertently send him to better meals, better housing, and a chance at celebrity. Surviving gladiators could win money, adoration, and even freedom. The gamble was real. Instead of punishment, the slave might rise in status while the master lost all claim. Picture the amphitheatre at dawn. The sand is raked smooth, the gates creak open, and a branded runaway turned gladiator strides into the light. His old master, seated among the crowd, clenches his fists, praying for a lion to devour him. Instead, the man fights brilliantly, wins the crowd's favour, and is spared. The cheers wash over him while his former owner sits in silence, humiliated. That risk alone kept many masters from gambling slaves on the arena. Historians continue to puzzle over this paradox. Was the threat of gladiatorial sale more psychological than real? Did it function more as a boogeyman than as a routine punishment? The lack of mass evidence suggests it was not widespread, but stories, plays, and graffiti prove it was always on people's minds. Like telling a child, "Behave or I'll sell you to the circus," masters dangled the arena as a terrifying possibility, even if they rarely followed through. Another quirky angle: the Colosseum itself became a place where rules mattered. Slaves in the audience could not simply be seized and thrown into the sand for fun. Games were carefully staged, regulated by editors and magistrates. The arena belonged to the state, not to individual whims. Masters were reminded again and again, your authority ends at the amphitheatre gate. Inside, Rome's rules take over. You can almost smile at the irony. The very symbol of cruelty, the gladiatorial arena, was also a place where masters lost some of their power. The spectacle was too important to be sullied by private vendettas. Slaves could die there, yes, but only on Rome's terms. The dominus, accustomed to snapping his fingers and seeing obedience, had to watch in silence as the crowd, the editor, and even fate itself decided a slave's outcome. So the gladiator gamble was exactly that, a gamble. Masters who tried to use it as punishment risked losing control, wasting money, or inadvertently elevating their slaves. Threatening the arena worked as intimidation, but following through was fraught with restrictions, and those restrictions reveal once more the theme echoing through your night walk. The dominus might strut in his atrium like a king, but outside, in law and custom, his crown was always crooked. As you leave the shadow of the amphitheatre, you can still hear phantom cheers. They remind you of the strange truth. The arena, built as a monument to domination, doubled as a space where the enslaved could wrest a measure of agency, and where masters discovered, sometimes painfully, that their power was never absolute. You leave behind the ghostly arches of the amphitheatre and find yourself in a quieter quarter of the city. Here, behind thick wooden gates, lie the training yards and workshops where slaves learn their crafts. You hear the faint ring of hammer on bronze, the scrape of stylus on wax, the shouts of a drill instructor timing marching feet. Training is everywhere in Rome. Slaves as cooks, scribes, bodyguards, artisans, accountants. But just as with punishments and gladiatorial games, the empire drew lines. There were certain things masters could not train slaves to do, certain skills considered too dangerous, too destabilizing, or too sacred to entrust to those in bondage. Training limits became another boundary, hemming in what looked like boundless authority. Think of it from a master's perspective. Slaves were investments, and training them increased their value. A skilled secretary fetched more at auction than an unskilled porter. A slave who could read contracts or compose poetry elevated the master's prestige. But not every type of knowledge could be shared. Rome feared what might happen if the enslaved learned too much. Literacy, martial arts, even rhetoric. These were carefully monitored, parcelled out, or outright forbidden depending on the context. Literacy provides the clearest example. Some masters taught their slaves to read and write, especially if they served as clerks, teachers, or copyists. Yet others shuddered at the thought. A literate slave could forge documents, spread seditious pamphlets, or send secret letters. Stories circulated of slaves penning satirical verses that mocked their owners, so while training in literacy was common, it carried stigma. Roman jurists warned that teaching slaves too much exposed households to risks, and masters who did so carelessly were considered imprudent. Historians still debate how widespread literacy among slaves really was. Some point to graffiti scrawled by enslaved hands in Pompeii as proof that many could read at least a little. Others argue that literacy remained the domain of specialised household staff. The argument swirls on, but the restriction is clear. Masters couldn't universally or recklessly educate their slaves without facing suspicion or social critique. And then there's military training. Rome's legions were fiercely protective of their expertise. Training slaves in the arts of war, formation, swordplay, strategy, was heavily discouraged and in many cases outright forbidden. After the terrifying revolt of Spartacus in the 70s BCE, the state became paranoid about giving enslaved people any martial advantage. Imagine a master teaching his bodyguards advanced spear drills. Neighbours would whisper, "Is he arming a private army?" Before long, officials might investigate, and the master could face charges of endangering public safety. This fear of armed slaves runs deep in Roman history. After Spartacus led an army of runaway gladiators and slaves that humiliated Rome's legions for 2 years, laws grew sharper. Masters could still keep household guards, but these were tightly controlled. They were expected to defend, not to train like legionaries. The empire wanted only citizens in armour, not slaves. The prohibition became both law and cultural taboo. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman satire sometimes poked fun at masters who tried to train their slaves in lofty arts like philosophy or oratory. One poet sneered about a master whose slave grew so eloquent that he embarrassed his owner in debate. The lesson was obvious. Don't train your slaves to outshine you. It was seen as foolish, even comical. So while rhetoric was celebrated among elites, it was considered risky when shared with those in chains. Philosophers themselves recognised the contradiction. Epictetus, once a slave, became a Stoic teacher whose words shaped generations. His life proved that training could transform a slave into a thinker of enduring influence. And yet, most masters recoiled from that possibility. The system demanded obedience, not brilliance. Training limits functioned as self-defense for masters afraid of losing face or control. Religion added another layer. Certain priesthoods and rituals barred slaves from specialized training. Sacred chants, augury, and rites of divination were deemed unsuitable for enslaved hands. To teach them would pollute the ritual and risk divine anger. So while slaves might prepare offerings or sweep temples, they could not be trained as augurs or flamens. The gods themselves imposed ceilings on what knowledge could be shared. Imagine standing in a workshop where a slave carefully etches wax tablets with contracts. His master trusts him with sums of money, with customers' names, even with the household's accounts. Yet that same slave will never be taught to stand in the forum and deliver a speech. The boundary is invisible but firm. You may know numbers, but not persuasion. Letters, but not rhetoric. It's like giving someone the keys to your house, but never the alarm code. Knowledge was doled out in careful slices, always beneath the watchful eye of anxiety. Archaeological finds tell the story too. Inscriptions celebrate slaves trained as skilled artisans, sometimes naming them as masters of crafts. One mosaic even depicts a slave teaching music. But nowhere do we find evidence of slaves trained as military captains or courtroom advocates. The silence is telling. The state and society drew limits, making sure knowledge served households without threatening the broader hierarchy. Historians still puzzle over whether these limits were consistently enforced. Did some wealthy eccentrics train their slaves in forbidden skills anyway? Perhaps. Anecdotes survive of masters teaching favoured slaves advanced subjects, only to regret it when the student grew too bold. The practice may have existed in shadows, but publicly it was discouraged. Once again, restraint emerged not from compassion but from fear. Fear of rebellion, embarrassment, or divine displeasure. Let's pause for a touch of humour. Picture a pompous senator trying to train his slave to argue philosophy, only to find himself cornered by clever Stoic logic at dinner. The guests laugh, the senator blushes, and suddenly the idea of training limits feels very practical. Don't arm your slaves with the tools to embarrass you. That was as much a rule as any written law. So as you leave the training yard behind, the truth is clear. Rome depended on skilled slaves, but it also feared them. Training limits marked another leash, invisible but firm. Masters could instruct, but not endlessly. Knowledge, like power, was rationed carefully, and every lesson taught was a reminder that the boundary between tool and person was thinner than Rome dared admit. The night quiets again, and you carry with you the image of slaves both empowered and restrained by their training. Proof that even education itself became a battlefield of control. Masters ruled, yes, but within the narrow corridors that fear and order carved around them. The stars hang lower now, and as you pass into the Forum Romanum you feel the weight of silence over stone columns that once rang with voices. Here, under the watchful gaze of statues and gossiping crowds, another restraint on the master's hand reveals itself. Not every act of humiliation was acceptable. Not every outburst of cruelty could be hidden behind villa walls. A dominus who treated his slaves with excessive scorn in public could find himself judged not only by magistrates but by neighbours, clients, and even strangers. Reputation mattered in Rome, sometimes more than law, and it created public shame lines, invisible thresholds beyond which a master's authority transformed into disgrace. Imagine a master berating a slave at the market, shouting so loudly that fishmongers and bakers turn their heads. A slap, a shove, perhaps even a kick might pass as everyday spectacle. But drag it too far, strip a slave naked in the street, force him to eat garbage, beat him until blood ran. And suddenly, the master risked more than laughter. He risked censure, whispers that he had lost his dignity, that he was less Roman and more barbarian. Romans prided themselves on moderation. Modus, the idea of measured behaviour, was central to their identity. Excessive cruelty blurred the line between Roman citizen and the despised barbarian tribes they conquered. Thus, humiliations in public became dangerous. A master might think he was asserting control, but bystanders might see only loss of self-control. In a society where reputation was political capital, that distinction mattered. Historians still debate how much this shame culture protected slaves in practice. Some argue it was only surface level, restraining the elite who feared scandal. Others suggest it penetrated deeply, shaping daily interactions even in crowded markets. The disagreement continues, but the principle remains. Public humiliation could boomerang back on the humiliator. Here's a quirky tidbit from Roman satire. Juvenal once mocked a wealthy woman who, in her fury, forced her slaves to endure absurd punishments in front of guests. She ordered one to hold a fly swatter over her plate for hours, another to pour endless cups of water only to throw them away. The joke wasn't just on the slaves, it was on her. Audiences laughed at her ridiculous excess, proving that cruelty turned into comedy when it crossed certain lines. The humour worked like a mirror, reminding masters that public scorn was never far away. Consider also the importance of the patron-client system. A master's dignity was currency in the complex web of Roman politics. If word spread that he debased himself by publicly humiliating his slaves, clients might drift away, peers might sneer, and rivals might pounce. Even senators could not risk looking foolish. Thus, restraint became self-preservation. The very structure of society, its hunger for honour, clipped the master's tongue and hand. Philosophers weighed in, as they always did. Seneca scolded those who humiliated slaves, warning that such acts dishonoured the soul more than the body. Musonius Rufus declared that laughter at cruelty was laughter at madness, not at power. Their words carried weight among elites eager to appear wise. A man who prided himself on philosophy could not risk being seen as a brute in the marketplace. Picture this. A master drags his slave into the forum, intending to flog him as an example. The whip cracks, but instead of awe, the crowd murmurs uneasily. Some turn away, others smirk, and a few whisper that he lacks gravitas, the dignity expected of a Roman male. What began as a performance of authority collapses into embarrassment. The master, red-faced, retreats. The slave is bruised but not destroyed, and the lesson is clear. Public shame lines saved bodies by protecting reputations. Even religion joined in. Certain festivals, like Saturnalia, allowed slaves to mock their masters openly, a ritualized inversion of hierarchy. The laughter was sanctioned, expected even. A master who resisted too harshly risked appearing sacrilegious, unwilling to honour tradition. The gods themselves, it seemed, enjoyed seeing masters teased. That annual ritual reinforced the idea that humiliation had limits, and those limits were watched not only by men but by divine eyes. Archaeology hints at this restraint too. Inscriptions on tombstones often praised masters for treating slaves with dignity. "He ruled his household with justice, not cruelty," reads one epitaph. These claims may have been exaggerated, but why boast about moderation if cruelty were admired? Clearly society rewarded the image of restraint, punishing reputations that leaned too far toward humiliation. Of course, not every slave was spared. Behind closed doors, humiliation flourished, shielded from prying eyes. But in public, with gossip ready to pounce, masters thought twice. They knew that a single scandal could stain generations, for Roman memory was long. The same society that glorified triumphs never forgot disgrace. And here's where humour helps again. Imagine a senator at a banquet boasting about flogging a slave in the forum. Instead of admiration, guests chuckle, recalling that he tripped on his toga during the ordeal. The story spreads, twisting his cruelty into comedy. In Rome, to be ridiculous was worse than to be feared. And so, the public shame line functioned like an invisible leash, pulling back the hand that rose too high. Historians still wonder whether slaves themselves leveraged this. Did they sometimes provoke humiliation in public, knowing the crowd's sympathy might restrain the master? Perhaps. There are hints and stories of slaves crying out loudly during punishments, drawing attention, forcing the dominus to stop. If so, then shame lines became weapons, fragile but real, in the enslaved person's quiet arsenal. As you leave the forum's shadow, the lesson lingers. Rome was a society of masks, performances, and endless scrutiny. Masters could command much, but they could not command perception. And perception was power. The public shame line ensured that even in a world built on domination, authority could crumble in a single laugh, a single whisper, a single raised eyebrow in the crowd. So you walk on, hearing faint echoes of gossip that once rippled through these stones. They remind you that cruelty unchecked was not only dangerous to slaves, it was dangerous to masters themselves. Rome demanded dignity, and dignity demanded restraint. The air feels damp now as you turn into a narrow alley where a fountain trickles lazily, its basin worn smooth by countless hands. You notice the faint outlines of old graffiti, names, prayers, little jokes scratched into plaster. One of them reads like a plea, "Valerius, heal quickly." It's a reminder that even in chains the body was fragile and sickness stalked every household. And here lies another restraint on masters. They could not simply ignore the health of their slaves. Rome was too practical, too obsessed with order, to let illness and injury be dismissed as mere inconveniences. Healthcare obligations, both cultural and legal, forced owners to act. Picture a farm in Campania during harvest. A slave collapses from fever, shivering under the blazing sun. The master may sigh at the inconvenience, but he cannot just leave the man to die in the fields. Why? Because the state, philosophers, and even neighbours expected more. A neglected slave could infect others, reduce productivity, and signal that the master was careless. In a society where reputation was everything, negligence could brand a dominus as incompetent. Roman law touched on this directly. Jurists preserved in the digest acknowledged that slaves required medical attention, and masters bore the duty to provide it. Some legal texts even recognise negligence in failing to treat wounds or illnesses as grounds for intervention. Imagine the embarrassment of a master summoned to court because his slave died from untreated infection. Even if the case didn't end in conviction, the scandal would stain his name. Historians still debate how effectively these obligations protected the enslaved. Some argue they were minimal, designed purely to preserve property value. Others see in them a faint echo of humanitarian instinct. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Rome needed slaves healthy, and that necessity created pressure on masters to provide at least basic care. Here's a quirky tidbit. In large households and estates, slaves sometimes acted as doctors for each other. Known as medici servorum, these enslaved healers were trained in basic medicine, setting bones, mixing herbal remedies, even performing surgeries. Archaeological finds from medical kits suggest their skills were surprisingly advanced. For a master, it was far cheaper to train one slave in medicine than to hire a freeborn doctor for every illness. Yet once trained, these slave doctors became powerful figures within the household, commanding respect from peers and sometimes even from their owners. Philosophers, of course, weighed in. Celsus, though not a Stoic, wrote extensively on medicine and emphasized that all people, slave or free, deserved treatment. Seneca scolded masters who refused care, calling them cruel not only to others but to themselves. His reasoning was typically Stoic. Neglecting a sick slave was irrational, because the health of the household depended on every member. Even if compassion wasn't the motive, logic demanded attention. Imagine the scene inside a villa. A cook burns his hand on a pan. Instead of being cast aside, he's bandaged and treated, because losing him would ruin the household's rhythm. Another slave limps with a festering wound. The master grumbles but orders the medicus to clean it. Not from kindness, but from fear of contagion and disruption. The whip might drive obedience, but it could not heal infection. Only care could. Archaeology adds more weight. Inscriptions praise masters who provided medical treatment, boasting that they kept their slaves healthy. Tombstones of freedmen sometimes thank former owners for tending to their illnesses. Were these exaggerations carved for appearances? Perhaps, but the fact that masters bragged about healthcare shows it was an expected duty, one that earned honour. A cruel dominus might be feared, but a negligent one was despised. There's also the matter of food. Proper nutrition was part of healthcare, and Roman writers commented on it frequently. Columella, the agricultural expert, insisted that slaves be fed adequately, not starved, especially during intense labour. He argued that thin, sickly slaves weakened the estate's reputation and profits. His words became guidelines, shaping expectations. Masters who ignored them risked looking not only cruel, but incompetent at managing resources. And here's a touch of humour from the sources. Some masters were mocked for pampering their slaves with too much medical attention. One satirist sneered at a wealthy lady who summoned doctors for every cough among her servants, turning her villa into a clinic. The joke, of course, was on her excess. But behind the laughter was acknowledgement that care was normal. The satire only worked because audiences knew the opposite extreme. Total neglect was unacceptable. Sanctuary laws even touched on healthcare. A slave who was gravely abused or denied treatment could flee to a temple and claim protection, arguing that neglect was cruelty. Magistrates might then order the slave sold to another owner. This possibility forced masters to provide at least minimal care, lest their negligence be exposed in sacred or legal spaces. Historians continue to puzzle over the role of slave doctors. Were they respected professionals or merely tools? Evidence suggests both. Some became so trusted that they treated freeborn patients as well, blurring boundaries. Others remained confined to tending their fellow slaves. Yet their existence proves the point. Rome institutionalized healthcare within slavery, and masters were bound to sustain it. Now imagine a plague sweeping through a city block. Freeborn citizens flee, but slaves remain, coughing and feverish. The master cannot abandon them entirely, for their deaths would devastate his household. He brings in a medicus, fumigates rooms, and offers remedies. The scene is grim, yet it reveals how obligation tied even the harshest owner to his slave's survival. Power was never absolute. It bent under the weight of necessity. And here's where debate continues. Did healthcare obligations truly soften slavery, or did they simply make exploitation more efficient? Scholars argue late into the night, some pointing to inscriptions of gratitude, others to grim accounts of neglect. But regardless of motive, the effect was real. Masters could not ignore sickness without risking scandal, inefficiency, or divine anger. As you leave the fountain behind, you imagine the countless hands that once touched its cool water, some shaking with fever, others steady from recovery. The sound of trickling reminds you that life in Rome was precarious, but never without boundaries. Even chains could not silence the demand for care, and even masters discovered that their authority stopped where illness began. So the night whispers its lesson. In the empire of domination, health itself was a leash. Masters could command labour, but they could not command the body to heal. They had to tend it, however, reluctantly, and in doing so they revealed yet again that their power was never as absolute as it seemed. The sky above Rome has paled to a softer black, stars dimming as if the city itself is preparing to exhale. You walk past a row of small marble monuments, each carved with inscriptions, names of men and women who once were enslaved but later stood free. Some stones are simple, others proud, boasting of offices held, businesses built, or children born into citizenship. These memorials whisper of another limit that weighed on masters, the strange, inescapable shadow of freedom. For once, a promise of manumission was given. Once liberty dangled before a slave's eyes, the master could not always pull it back. Roman slavery was unique in that manumission. The act of freeing a slave was not only possible but woven into the fabric of society. Freedmen swelled the city's population, filling trades, offices, and guilds. Masters often freed loyal slaves in wills, at festivals, or after years of service. But what matters here is that once freedom was promised, the master's authority was chained to that promise. He could not arbitrarily undo it without consequence. Imagine a master boasting at dinner, "I will free my cook after 10 years' service." The words may have been casual, perhaps uttered to impress guests. But to Rome, a promise like that carried weight. If he reneged later, the freedmen's peers, neighbours, and even magistrates could condemn him. Written promises were even stronger. Tablets inscribed with manumission pledges could be enforced by courts, ensuring the master's word became law. The dominus, who believed he ruled absolutely, found himself trapped by his own generosity. Historians still debate why Rome embraced manumission so widely. Some argue it was economic, replenishing the citizen body with loyal ex-slaves. Others see it as social control, offering hope to keep the enslaved obedient. The arguments swirl, but all agree on this. Once liberty was promised, it cast a shadow that no master could ignore. Slaves lived in that shadow, shaping their behaviour around it, while masters discovered their own power, diminished by the very act of offering it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Augustus, ever the master strategist, actually placed limits on manumission, passing the Lex Fufia Caninia and Lex Aelia Sentia in the early 1st century CE. These laws capped the number of slaves one could free in a will and restricted the ages at which slaves could be freed. Augustus wasn't trying to protect masters, he was trying to protect society from being flooded by freedmen. Yet the effect was the same. Once manumission was formalised, masters had to play by the rules. Even emperors shaped the boundaries, reminding everyone that freedom was a public matter, not a private whim. Picture a slave clutching a wax tablet that recorded his impending freedom. Each day of labour brought him closer to release, and each stroke of the plough or sweep of the broom carried hope. The master might rage at his mistakes, but he could not snatch back the written word. To do so was to challenge Rome itself, for contracts and promises formed the empire's backbone. A master who tore up such a document risked more than dishonour. He risked legal action, fines, or confiscation. Philosophers took notice too. Seneca praised manumission as an act of dignity, though he warned against using it carelessly. Epictetus, once freed himself, embodied the possibility that freedom transformed lives. Their reflections seeped into culture, making freedom not merely a reward but a moral stage upon which masters proved their virtue. To promise and then retract was to admit cruelty, weakness, or deceit. In a society obsessed with image, that was poison, and the rituals of freedom deepened the shadow. When a slave was manumitted, it often happened in front of a magistrate, with formal ceremonies like the vindicta, where a rod touched the slave's head to mark liberty, or at a temple, where gods bore witness. These public rituals meant that manumission was never just a private affair. Once announced, the promise echoed across witnesses, law, and divine memory. The master was no longer in total command. He was bound by his own oath, enforced by society and the gods. Here's a little humour to lighten it. Imagine a master declaring dramatically, "I free you," at a banquet, only to regret it the next morning after too much wine. Too late, the guests remembered, the story spread, and the freed slave might already be boasting in the forum. Rome was a city where gossip travelled faster than any runner. Even drunken promises risked becoming binding, another invisible leash tugging at the master's wrist. Archaeology reminds us of this shadow too. Countless inscriptions celebrate freedmen, proudly naming their former masters. Some even exaggerate the generosity, declaring, "He freed me without hesitation." Were these boasts sincere, or propaganda paid for by the freedmen themselves? Either way, they show how manumission shaped reputations. A master known for freeing slaves earned honour, one known for reneging earned scorn. But not all shadows were bright. Some masters used manumission as manipulation, offering it, delaying it, dangling it like a carrot. Yet even this trick carried risk. Delay too long, and resentment brewed. Promise too lightly, and reputation suffered. Masters discovered that freedom, once spoken, took on a life of its own. They had to tiptoe through their own words, lest they trap themselves in obligations they hadn't meant to honour. Historians still argue over whether this made slavery more tolerable or more insidious. Was freedom's shadow a genuine path to liberty, or merely a tool of control? Perhaps both. For some, it was real, an escape into citizenship, the chance to marry legally, to own property, to vote. For others, it was illusion. Hope stretched across decades until death arrived first. Yet either way, the shadow restrained masters, reminding them that their slaves might one day stand beside them as equals in the forum. That possibility alone forced caution. So picture this: a master about to flog a slave who already held a manumission promise. The whip hangs in the air, but hesitation creeps in. Beat him too badly, and tomorrow that man might be free, carrying scars and bitter stories to the magistrates. The shadow of freedom softened the blow, even if only slightly. It created a horizon beyond slavery, and that horizon bent the master's will. As you leave the row of monuments behind, the lesson is clear. Rome's world of chains was haunted by liberty, always present, always possible, always complicating the dominus's control. Freedom once promised could not be withdrawn without consequence, and in that reality lay yet another boundary, another reminder that no matter how heavy the chains, the shadow of release was always near. The faintest streak of dawn brushes the horizon now, a grey veil softening the edges of Rome's rooftops. You walk toward the Curia, the Senate House, its doors still shut, but you can almost hear the murmurs of senators debating, scribes scratching, and emperors weighing their words like gold. For here you uncover another restraint on masters: politics. However grand a dominus felt within his atrium, his power was clipped by the larger game of governance. The Senate, the emperors, and the machinery of the state sometimes reached into the private sphere of slavery, clipping authority in the name of stability. It was not mercy but control, yet it created real limits. Slavery, after all, was not just a household institution, it was the empire's foundation. Fields, workshops, mines, and villas pulsed with enslaved labour. If every master ruled unchecked, Rome risked chaos, and chaos was the enemy of politics. So the state stepped in, reminding even the proudest aristocrats that their households were miniature pieces of a much larger puzzle. One of the clearest examples came after the terrifying revolt of Spartacus in 73 BCE. Tens of thousands of slaves rose up, defeating Roman legions, marching across Italy, and striking fear into every villa. Rome won in the end, but the scars ran deep. Never again could the state allow masters to mismanage their slaves so badly that rebellion boiled over. Political measures followed, restrictions on training slaves as fighters, rules about manumission, laws about punishment. Masters discovered that their private authority was not entirely private. It was subject to the nervous eye of the state. Historians still debate how much these laws were motivated by fear versus efficiency. Some argue they were mainly symbolic, meant to reassure citizens after the trauma of revolt. Others believe they were practical, ensuring that households did not become breeding grounds of unrest. Either way, the political message was clear. Masters were not sovereign kings, but participants in a system overseen by Senate and Emperor alike. Here's a quirky tidbit. Augustus, master of political theatre, was obsessed with regulating households. He issued laws not only about slaves, but also about marriage, inheritance, and family behaviour. Imagine living in a world where the emperor dictated not just your taxes, but your bedroom. His rules on manumission, limiting how many slaves could be freed in a will, were part of this larger vision. Augustus feared that floods of freedmen might destabilise politics, so he tightened control. In doing so, he reminded masters that their decisions about liberty were political acts, not private indulgences. You can almost smile at the irony. An aristocrat might puff his chest, boasting of ruling dozens of slaves, yet tremble at the thought of offending imperial policy. The same man who barked orders in his atrium bowed nervously when laws dictated how many slaves he could manumit, how he could punish, even how he should feed them. Power, so absolute at home, shrank in the shadow of politics. Philosophers too framed slavery in political terms. Seneca mused that cruelty towards slaves threatened the moral fabric of society, while Musonius Rufus argued that moderation was necessary for civic stability. Their voices fed into elite anxieties. A master who acted outrageously risked not just personal shame but political repercussions. To mistreat slaves was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny from Rome's ruling class was never gentle. Imagine a senator standing in the Curia, defending himself against accusations that his cruelty sparked unrest. His face burns as rivals snicker, using his scandal to score political points. Masters dreaded such scenes. Better to restrain oneself than to hand opponents a weapon. Thus, politics shaped behaviour more sharply than lawbooks ever could. Archaeology supports this picture. Inscriptions boast of masters who governed their households with justice. The word governed is telling. A household was a microcosm of the state, and how one ruled slaves reflected on one's ability to rule citizens. Politics, reputation, and authority braided together, until every lash of the whip carried political weight. And here's some humour from Roman satire. Juvenal mocked senators who strutted in the forum but cowered in their villas, terrified of slave uprisings. The joke worked because audiences recognised the truth. Masters were never as secure as they pretended. Their politics of control cut both ways. They tried to dominate, yet were themselves dominated by fear of rebellion and scrutiny. Historians still puzzle over whether Rome's political interventions truly improved slaves' lives or merely tightened the empire's grip. Did restrictions on manumission and punishment ease suffering, or did they simply protect the state? Perhaps both. What is undeniable is that politics created another leash. Masters who imagined themselves free to command as they pleased discovered that their freedom was conditional, always subject to Rome's larger needs. Picture now the Emperor Hadrian, issuing decrees against arbitrary killings of slaves. Was he motivated by compassion? Unlikely. More probably, he feared that unchecked cruelty bred instability. But for the slave, the motive mattered little. A decree was a decree, and its effect was real. A master hesitated before killing, not because his heart softened, but because politics loomed. And politics could be fickle. One emperor might emphasize moderation, another might ignore it. Masters lived with the uncertainty, adjusting their behaviour according to shifting winds. Their power was never absolute. It was negotiated daily with laws, decrees, and the eyes of rivals ready to exploit any misstep. So as you linger before the Curia, the Senate House silhouetted against the paling sky, you understand the paradox. Masters strutted as dominators, yet politics always clipped their wings. They could command, but only within the framework Rome allowed. Their authority was vast but never sovereign, checked again and again by the larger needs of empire. And in that truth lies the lesson of this section. Politics was not just something that happened in marble halls. It seeped into kitchens, fields, and workshops. Every slave bore the weight of politics on their shoulders, and every master discovered that his own hand was guided by invisible strings pulled from the capital itself. The sky grows lighter, and the whispers of senators fade into morning birdsong. But the reminder lingers. In Rome, the politics of control restrained even the rulers of households, proving once again that no dominus held unchecked power, not in law, not in religion, and certainly not in politics. The sun has not yet broken the horizon, but the air carries that faint silvery brightness before dawn, and you find yourself near a cluster of domus villas. The women of these houses, matrons in fine stolas, slave girls in tunics, move like shadows preparing for the day. And here, among the rustle of fabric and the clink of buckets drawn from wells, you begin to see another layer of limits imposed on masters, gendered restraints. For when it came to women enslaved in Rome, extra rules, customs, and anxieties often clipped the hands of owners who thought themselves omnipotent. It may surprise you to learn that Roman society, so harsh in its hierarchies, had special sensitivities around female slaves. They were property, yes, but also carried unique symbolic and social weight. Their bodies represented fertility, lineage, and honour. To treat them in certain ways risked scandal, pollution, or loss of status. Thus, masters had to tread carefully, not only in what labour they demanded, but in how they managed the intimate details of their lives. Consider marriage again. While male slaves might be paired with little fanfare, female slaves were often at the centre of greater scrutiny. A mistress might insist on controlling whom her maidservants partnered with, fearing jealousy or gossip. But selling a woman away from her children was frowned upon even more heavily than with men. Roman law and custom alike warned against appearing too heartless when it came to mothers. A dominus who ripped infants from their enslaved mothers could face whispers of cruelty that stained his household reputation. Historians still debate whether these restraints genuinely protected women or merely reinforced patriarchal anxieties about family honour. Some argue that concern for mothers was sincere, rooted in religious ideas about fertility. Others insist it was purely pragmatic. Healthy mothers birthed more future slaves. The quarrel continues, but both sides agree. Masters could not behave without limits when women were involved. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roman comedy loved to exaggerate the plight of the enslaved woman. Playwrights often showed clever slave girls outwitting their masters, protecting their chastity, or turning the tables on would-be abusers. Audiences laughed, but the joke carried weight. It reflected real unease about how women should be treated. Too much abuse wasn't just immoral, it was laughable, undignified, and beneath the image of a respectable Roman household. Sexual exploitation, though tragically widespread, also carried boundaries. A master could not flaunt his behaviour too openly, nor could he risk scandal by overstepping taboos. For example, taking advantage of a young virgin slave girl could be considered sacrilegious if she was tied to temple service. And noble women sometimes wielded their own authority to shield female slaves, insisting on modesty in the household. These weren't absolute protections, but they forced masters to measure their actions, lest they be accused of polluting not only their own dignity but their entire domus. Philosophers added another restraint by reframing how female slaves should be viewed. Musonius Rufus argued that women, even when enslaved, shared the same rational capacity as men. To abuse them was to ignore the divine spark of reason. Seneca too scolded masters for mistreating maids, urging them to remember that fortune changes swiftly, and tomorrow's slave might be tomorrow's citizen. Their words weren't law, but they echoed through elite circles, shaping how masters wanted to be seen. Imagine a Roman banquet. The mistress of the house arranges her serving women, ensuring they're neatly dressed, dignified, and free from visible bruises. Why? Not because she cared deeply for their welfare, but because guests would judge her household's order by their appearance. A battered or humiliated maid suggested not strength but chaos. In this way, gendered perception forced restraint. The master's authority bent under the weight of optics, especially when women were involved. And there's another curious restriction. Certain types of labour were considered inappropriate for enslaved women. Heavy ploughing, military guard duty, or dangerous construction were largely reserved for men. Women were channeled into domestic, textile, or childcare roles. This division, rooted in gender norms, unintentionally protected women from the harshest physical labour. A master who tried to break this pattern risked ridicule. The Romans, so fond of order, believed each body had its place. To ignore that order was to invite mockery. Archaeology adds texture to this picture. Tombstones of female slaves sometimes describe them as faithful nurses or beloved seamstresses, roles that carried trust and gentleness. These inscriptions hint that women carved out spaces where their work was respected, even cherished. Masters who mistreated them too obviously risked undermining their own legacy. After all, who wanted to be remembered as the man who beat the nurse who raised his children? Yet contradictions abounded. Female slaves could be treasured or exploited, praised or silenced, elevated or discarded. But through it all, gendered restraints circled their masters. The Dominus discovered he was not free to treat women however he pleased. Society, religion, and reputation all peered over his shoulder. Here's a touch of humour to soften the picture. Roman poets sometimes joked that female slaves ran households better than their masters. One verse describes a matron's maid scolding her dominus for poor financial choices, while he sulks like a boy. The laugh came not only from role reversal but from recognition. Women, even enslaved ones, wielded subtle power, and masters, for all their bluster, were not immune to being managed in return. Historians continue to explore whether these restraints represented real improvement for women or simply shifted exploitation into different forms. Some argue that emphasis on modesty protected bodies, others say it only protected appearances. Yet whichever interpretation you choose, the pattern is clear. Gender mattered. It bent the rules, shaped expectations, and created another leash on masters who imagined themselves all-powerful. As the dawn glimmers brighter, you picture a Roman household stirring to life. Maids sweeping courtyards, nurses tending infants, matrons overseeing the loom. Behind each gesture lies an unspoken truth. Female slaves brought with them special rules, cultural boundaries, and silent negotiations. Masters could command much, but they could not erase gendered restraints woven into Rome's very identity. So as you continue your walk, hearing the first rooster crow beyond the city walls, you carry this insight with you. Even in an empire of domination, the presence of women shaped the edges of power, proving yet again that slavery's chains bound masters as much as they bound the enslaved. The first light of dawn brushes the rooftops now, painting them with a pale orange glow. The clatter of wagons begins in the forum, but your path carries you toward a quieter portico, where philosophers once lectured in measured tones. Their words linger like incense in the air, sharp, sometimes unsettling, sometimes soothing, and it is here you discover another restraint on masters, the challenge of philosophy. For while law and politics hemmed in authority from without, philosophy chipped away from within, reminding masters that cruelty was not only impractical but shameful, irrational, even un-Roman. You must picture the scene. A master, reclining on his couch, whip in hand, ready to chastise a servant for some mistake. Into this moment intrudes the voice of Stoic teachers, carried through letters, lectures, and gossip. Remember, that man is your fellow rational being. Suddenly the whip feels heavier. Perhaps it still falls, but perhaps less often, less savagely, because philosophy has planted seeds of doubt. Seneca, tutor to the infamous Nero, was especially insistent. In his letters, he wrote that slaves were not enemies or beasts, but companions in misfortune. They are men, he reminded his fellow elites, and share in reason. He went so far as to advise masters to dine with their slaves sometimes, not to erase hierarchy, but to cultivate respect. Radical words in their way, for a world where slaves were usually fed separately. These admonitions did not overturn slavery, but they did push boundaries, forcing masters to consider restraint. Historians still argue whether such philosophy genuinely changed daily life. Were Seneca's words applied widely, or were they polite ideals ignored by most? Some scholars claim they softened the edges of cruelty among elites who sought reputations for wisdom. Others dismissed them as rhetorical flourishes, written to burnish moral credentials while nothing changed in kitchens and fields. The debate remains lively, but even if largely rhetorical, the philosophy of moderation carried real cultural weight. Here's a quirky tidbit. Epictetus, perhaps the most famous Stoic slave-turned-teacher, transformed his very life into an argument. Once bound by chains, later freed, he lectured on dignity, reason, and the futility of cruelty. His mere existence unsettled masters, proof that the enslaved could embody virtue more powerfully than those who owned them. Imagine a dominus at a dinner party, mocked by a guest who says, "That philosopher you admire was once a slave." The laughter would sting. Philosophy became a mirror, showing masters that their victims might surpass them in wisdom. Cicero, though less radical, also underscored restraint. In his treatises on duty, he argued that justice extended beyond citizens, hinting at a universal order binding all humans. His words implied, if not declared outright, that brutality against slaves offended the gods of order. For a master eager to appear a man of mos maiorum, ancestral virtue, such whispers carried weight. Picture again a villa at dawn. A slave spills wine and the master's hand rises, but then he recalls Seneca's phrase, "All cruelty is weakness." If he lashes out, he risks appearing weak, childish, lacking self-control. To be cruel was not to be strong, it was to be ridiculous, and in Rome, ridicule could wound more deeply than law. So the hand lowers, the punishment softened. The slave still suffers, but less than he might have, thanks to philosophy's subtle intrusion. Archaeological evidence hints at the influence of these ideas. Inscriptions sometimes describe freedmen praising their former masters for treating them with humanitas, a word meaning humanity, kindness, civilization. Masters carved these boasts into stone because society valued them, and society valued them because philosophers had taught them to. To be praised for moderation became as desirable as to be praised for triumphs. Philosophy rewired honour. Of course, not all listened. Many mocked philosophers as dreamers. Juvenal, the satirist, sneered at elites who pretended to treat slaves kindly, but still flogged them in secret. Yet even mockery proves influence. You do not satirize what no one is talking about. The very existence of such jokes reveals that philosophy's challenge was heard, even if not always followed. And here's a moment of humour for you. One philosopher supposedly scolded a master so severely for cruelty that the master released the slave out of embarrassment. Later, when asked why, he grumbled, "It was easier to lose the slave than to lose face." The story is almost comic, yet it shows how ideas bent actions. The master might not have cared about mercy, but he cared about looking foolish in front of the wise. Historians continue to wrestle with whether Stoicism and other schools planted seeds for later concepts of universal human dignity. Some trace a direct line from Seneca to Enlightenment thinkers, others dismiss that as romantic projection. But within Rome itself, the challenge was immediate. Philosophers told masters that their authority was not absolute, that to overstep was to diminish themselves. Religious philosophy added its own flavour. Mystery cults, Christianity in its infancy, and other belief systems whispered that all souls were equal before divine power. Though fringe at first, these ideas gnawed at the edges of slavery's ideology. To hear that God saw no distinction between master and slave unsettled the old order. A dominus might scoff, but the thought lingered, gnawing at certainty. Imagine walking past a portico at dawn, hearing a philosopher lecture, "You cannot own another's soul." The phrase lodges in your ear, repeating, haunting. You return home, look at your slaves, and something shifts. The chains remain, but your certainty falters. That faltering is philosophy's victory, small yet powerful, another leash tying down arrogance. And yet, contradictions abound. Some philosophers owned slaves themselves. Seneca, despite his eloquence, maintained households full of servants. The gap between words and deeds invites endless debate. Was philosophy genuine or hypocrisy? Scholars still argue, but the hypocrisy itself proves something. The need to appear moderate was real, and appearance often shaped behaviour. So as the sun brightens, you realise that philosophy's challenge mattered not because it ended slavery, but because it reshaped how power was judged. Cruelty became weakness, moderation became virtue, and masters discovered that their authority was tethered to ideals larger than themselves. The portico empties, the voices fade, but the words linger. They remind you that Rome was never just chains and whips. It was also arguments, lectures, and whispers that bent the proudest rulers toward restraint. Philosophy planted doubts in the hearts of masters, and those doubts grew into boundaries. So as you walk on into morning, the lesson shines clear. In Rome, the enslaved lived under chains, but those same chains bound their masters to ideals they could never fully escape. Philosophy, quiet and stubborn, clipped the wings of cruelty, reminding everyone that absolute power was always an illusion. The sun finally breaks the horizon now, pouring molten gold over the rooftops of Rome. Smoke rises from bakeries, sandals clatter on cobblestones, and the once-shadowed city hums awake. You've wandered through alleys of law, temples of restraint, courts of shame, and whispers of philosophy. Yet as morning floods the forum, you realise the story doesn't end here. The rules and limits that shaped slavery in Rome left echoes that carried far beyond the empire's fall. Masters thought themselves supreme, but the restrictions you've traced, legal, cultural, religious, philosophical, became seeds planted deep into Western thought. The echoes ripple outward still. Consider the courts. Rome's insistence that killing a slave could be murder, that cruelty could bring judicial intervention, planted an idea. The law could see even the lowliest as more than property. That principle resurfaced centuries later in medieval debates about serfdom, in Enlightenment arguments about natural rights, and in abolitionist cries that no human could be reduced to a thing. Rome did not abolish slavery, but it accidentally created precedents that made abolition thinkable. A master in the 2nd century CE who hesitated to kill his slave because of Hadrian's decree was, without realising it, participating in a legal tradition that would one day insist on universal personhood. Religious boundaries, too, sent long shadows. Sanctuary and temples foreshadowed later Christian practices of asylum in churches. A slave kneeling before Jupiter's altar became the ancestor of a fugitive serf clinging to a cathedral door in the Middle Ages. The logic endured. There are spaces masters cannot cross, powers greater than human ownership. Even today, when people talk of sacred rights, they echo that ancient sense that some boundaries stand inviolable, no matter how strong the oppressor. And family, the marriage dilemma, the respect for mothers, the reluctance to rip children from their enslaved parents, echoed into later laws about kinship. The Romans, by accident or design, admitted that love could not be fully erased by chains. Centuries later, abolitionists in the Americas made the same argument. Tearing families apart was not only cruel but unnatural. In this way, Rome's contradictions became rhetorical ammunition for those who fought slavery's later incarnations. Historians still argue how much continuity truly exists between Rome's restraints and later justice. Some see direct lines, others dismiss the echoes as coincidence. But the debate itself proves the power of memory. Rome became a mirror for later ages, a warning and a justification. Even in its cruelty, it supplied tools for criticising cruelty. Here's a quirky tidbit. Early Christian writers often invoked Roman laws about slaves when shaping their own teachings. They quoted emperors to argue that masters should show mercy, using pagan precedent to support Christian morality. It's ironic. Laws designed for political control became proof texts for divine compassion. And once those texts entered sermons and letters, their influence spread across centuries, whispered again and again in monasteries, councils and pulpits. Philosophy's challenge, too, echoed long after marble porticos crumbled. Seneca's insistence that cruelty is weakness reappears almost word for word in Enlightenment thinkers who denounce tyranny. Epictetus's story, rising from slavery to teach wisdom, inspired later generations to believe that dignity cannot be chained. The very existence of these voices made it impossible to erase the question, are slaves not human? Once asked, that question never vanished. Imagine a medieval scholar in a candlelit library, copying passages from the Digest or Seneca's letters. His quill scratches, his eyes blink against smoke, and he pauses at a phrase. Slaves are men. The words slip into his mind, into commentary, into debate. Centuries later, they resurface in a courtroom or a speech. That's how echoes work. They travel unseen, waiting for ears to catch them. Archaeology adds texture to this continuity. Tombstones of freedmen, proudly naming themselves citizens, became enduring monuments to transformation. Later societies saw them and wondered, if Rome could free its slaves and integrate them, why couldn't others? The stones stood like silent arguments, carved in Latin, challenging later generations to wrestle with freedom's possibility. And humour. Yes, even humour left echoes. Roman satires mocking cruel masters survived, copied by scribes who perhaps chuckled centuries later. The laughter kept alive the idea that cruelty was ridiculous, not just harsh. When modern readers smirk at Juvenal's caricatures, they join a chain of mockery stretching back 2,000 years, all aimed at puncturing the pomp of unchecked authority. Yet the echoes are complicated. Rome did not end slavery. It institutionalized it for centuries. The restraints you've traced tonight were narrow, fragile, often ignored. But precisely because they existed, they proved that limits were possible. They showed that power was never total, that ownership was never complete, that even in an empire of chains, cracks appeared. And in those cracks, later ages saw daylight. So as the city brightens, picture the long arc. Roman jurists scribbling in wax, Christian bishops preaching mercy, medieval serfs clutching at church doors, Enlightenment thinkers quoting Stoics, abolitionists pointing to Roman precedents, all connected, all echoing. Masters could not do everything, and from that simple truth, a seed of universality grew. Historians still quarrel over whether these echoes justify calling Rome progressive. Some scoff. How can a slave society be praised? Others insist the contradictions themselves are significant, for they birthed later debates. The quarrel may never end, but your walk through the night proves one thing. The restraints mattered, then and later. They shaped thought, practice, and eventually, the language of rights itself. Now the forum fills with merchants setting up stalls, children chasing each other, priests preparing morning sacrifices. The world of shadows has yielded today. You've traced the invisible leashes that clipped the hands of Roman masters. Law, religion, politics, philosophy, reputation, affection, practicality. Each alone was small, but together they formed a web. And through that web, echoes travelled, whispering into the centuries that followed. The night has carried you far, and now it ends in morning light. But before you drift to sleep, here is a final wind down, a gentle closing to ease you from marble streets into dreams. And now, listener, let the pace soften. The streets of Rome grow quieter in your imagination, the clatter of hooves fading, the murmurs of merchants dissolving into a gentle hum. You no longer feel the press of chains or the weight of law. Instead, you feel the cool of early morning air calm against your skin. The marble beneath your feet warms with sunlight, but in your mind it becomes a soft path, leading not to courts or temples, but to rest. Every echo you've followed, the laws, the rituals, the debates, now fades like ripples on water. The whip, the gavel, the philosopher's voice, all drift away, leaving only stillness. You can breathe slowly, deeply, as though the empire itself exhales with you. Imagine now a quiet villa garden. Laurel leaves sway gently, fountains trickle softly, and doves coo from tiled rooftops. The enslaved and the free alike are absent here. Only peace remains. A soft breeze carries the scent of roses and olive groves. You sit, eyes half closed, listening not to arguments or decrees, but to silence broken only by water and bird song. Your body grows heavier, your mind lighter. The harshness of Rome recedes into memory, distant as a dream you need not revisit. What lingers instead is reassurance. Even in the darkest systems, cracks appeared, and through those cracks slipped light. You are safe here, far from noise, far from judgment. So let the final image dissolve, the city of Rome, washed in dawn, shrinking behind you as you drift into rest. The world slows, the breath steadies, and all that remains is calm.